A hushed expectancy falls across the crowd. Good afternoon, my name's Tom Forden, I chair Grand Rounds. Welcome to Grand Rounds today. We try to keep the mix of topics wide and varied at Grand Rounds, mixing local talent and external speakers, and today we have both in one package, who was local talent and left and has come back. So I first met David Jeffrey 8 years ago, I suppose it must be now, when I worked in the undergraduate office here, and David Jeffrey was the student support mentor. And he worked with a number of medical students who are now doctors and probably registrars by now, I would have thought, to help them through the trials and tribulations of medical school, going from a freshly minted first year just straight out of school through to being a foundation doctor, and everything in between. And on top of that, the increasing number of graduate students and mature students and the challenges that all these people face as they go through what is a very challenging degree course. David tells me that he promised his wife that it would be a 3-year deal working here in Dundee, and it was 3 years to the day, and after he finished, he went back to Edinburgh, where he was so interested in the process of making a medical student that he wanted to do some research in the area, and he then took the decision at, I think it's fair to say, a later stage in life, to do a PhD. So he spent the last 5 years self-funding a PhD, exploring empathy with medical students. And I was delighted when Jordan got in touch with me earlier in the year to see if David could have a slot at Grand Rounds to talk about his PhD and what he found out in that work. He's written a book. Here is the book. So if you're interested in this, then please come and speak to us at the end, and we can show you how to get the book and retrospectively fund his PhD. David is going to do a small group session, I think, after this, for anybody who's interested to talk in more detail about what he's learnt and where this topic takes you. So if you're interested, then just hang around at the end and we'll whisk you off to a teaching room somewhere and see how we go. Okay, enough waffling on from me. I'm very pleased to welcome back David Jeffrey.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to come back to Dundee. I really enjoyed my work as an academic mentor here and became fascinated, as Tom has told you, about how students change from school to becoming doctors, the different rates of change, and so decided to look at empathy in medical students as a project over the next 5 years. But why should we study empathy? Why is this important? First of all, there's a widely perceived gap in empathy in clinical practice. I found, and many other colleagues found, the Francis report into the mid-staff's inquiry a shattering document to read, where patients were not dealt as individual human beings and basic care wasn't given. There have been a number of reports from the NHS Ombudsman indicating a lack of compassion, a lack of empathy in care. Paralleling this has been a discourse that perhaps medical students lose empathy as they go through their course. And this is largely on the basis of quantitative advice and quantitative research. And it kind of clashed with what I thought, really. I thought, well, this isn't how I saw students in Dundee. They were still very distressed when they saw poor practice and when patients weren't cared for. But I wanted to look at that. And then there have been calls for more empathy in clinical care. Not only Robert Francis, who did the report, but Don Berwick in the United States said that we should be spending more time listening to patients. And Catherine Calderwood here in Scotland, in her recent report, Realistic Medicine, heavily emphasises the importance of empathising and personalising care. And the GMC too, although they don't mention the word empathy in any of their documents, do say that the part of being a doctor is to treat a patient as an individual. So then after I did a preliminary literature research, I decided to develop some research questions into this area, and in 3 areas: about the nature of empathy, how did students talk about empathy, what was it, what did it mean to them, the influences on their empathy. What factors in their undergraduate curriculum did they describe as influencing their empathy, either enhancing or inhibiting it? And then also for them to reflect and say, how do they feel their empathy had changed as they went through the course? One of the things I found most difficult about doing this PhD is entering the research world of social science. My supervisors used to say to me, David, you've still got that positivist parrot on your shoulder. You've kind of got to look at the world in a different way and adopt a different philosophy. And because people are still quite suspicious of qualitative research, one has to go to great lengths to explain exactly the process of interpretation and how you got your results. But the thing to grasp is that qualitative research is based on subjectivity. It's concerned with how the social world is interpreted and experienced and understood. So it embraces subjectivity. Constructivism was the particular epistemology that I used, and that's concerned with making sense of the lived world from the individual student's perspective. That's what I'm interested in getting. This isn't like a scientific study where you're interested in enlisting hundreds of students. This is, what does this individual feel about their course and the things that influence their empathy? And the particular strand of qualitative research I used was phenomenology. It took me about 6 months to be able to say that. Anyway, phenomenology is both a philosophy and a research method, and it seeks to describe an individual's experience of a phenomenon, in this case empathy, and to gain a deeper understanding. And that's what all this research is about, is I want to try and understand what the students were saying to me. And kind of, I see phenomenology as kind of a craft, rather like weaving. My wife is a weaver, and that's her weaving. And I see the loom in this metaphor as the medical school. So this is the medical school, is the loom. And the vertical warp threads is the curriculum running through. And the weaver, in this case me, is taking the weft, the horizontal wools, and threading a story, each student's story. And what comes out is a pattern at the end. And it's for people to decide later, when they read this pattern, oh, these are things I agree with or disagree with. And so very much phenomenology is not about saying this is how it is for everybody. It's this is how some people see it. How does this translate to your experience? A little bit more about phenomenology. It's just to emphasize, it's the individual's, its perspective. It's to gain a deeper understanding of everyday experiences. And it's a dynamic craft. This is not easy research. This is about bracketing your assumptions, you're trying to keep them apart, your own assumptions of what you think's going on, and balancing that with reflexivity. You have to say where you're coming from, make it clear to the reader. What does this researcher feel about this subject? How is he influenced by it? Moving from the particular student to the general, from the particular student to their year to the whole curriculum, and from description of their stories to interpretation. And if we look at it, that's what I've been doing all my life as a clinician with patients. It's exactly the process. It's a phenomenological process, focusing on individuals, listening to their story, and trying to interpret meaning. The book on it is this one by Smith, Flowers and Larkin, who sound like a gang of market gardeners, but actually it's a brilliant book on the approach of phenomenology. And I can't go into it more, but if there's anyone here who's interested in doing qualitative research or wants to know a little bit more or chat about this, please just email me, because I really struggled with all of this to begin with. The study was carried out in a UK university and medical school, and as a sample of 2 cohorts of 8 medical students. And for a phenomenological study, that's a big number. But I kind of thought, kind of reflecting, I suppose, how I was as a medical student, these guys will all drop out after the first week. Not a bit of it. None of these 16 students missed a single interview over the 3 years they were followed. There was a preclinical group of 8 students and a clinical group of 8 students were followed for 3 years. I had one-to-one interviews for at least an hour, hour and a half with them during each academic year of the course, and these were recorded and transcribed. I had ethical approvals for the study. The students obviously were given a pseudonym to protect anonymity. They all signed a consent form which was reviewed, and they could have at any time drop out of the study. But as I say, far from it. These students were enthusiasts. They used to send me papers I hadn't read about empathy. The setting I just left as anonymous. It won't take geniuses to work out where it was, but it's a UK medical school which has a strong record in medical research, but a low rating in the recent student survey on teaching quality and teaching experience, student experience, In the preclinical years from 1 to 3, there's only very limited patient contact, and this is why I refer to, and it may be different here, to a preclinical and a clinical group, because although perhaps the saying from the university, they would say, oh no, it's clinical all the way through, the students very much saw that. This was preclinical and clinical. And a recent curriculum change when I started my study had made the intercalated science year compulsory. When you're starting qualitative research, you're coming back to that thing of removing your assumptions. You start with a literature search, but it's a sort of preliminary one because you don't want to have too many fixed views. I was interested on getting the students' views rather than, if you like, contaminating it with my views. So I had a bit of a literature search at the beginning, and then when I gathered the data, see the students' views, I looked at it again and said, how does this relate to research? But it kind of comes across that empathy is a really complex construct, which means different things to different people. It started with having an affective or emotional content. It started with a guy called Theodore Lips talking about Einfühlung, feeling into. I feel into a picture or a work of art or a book. So it was a strong emotional connection. Then later, philosophers like Heidegger and Husserl were interested with the concept of Verstehen, understanding. So it was more cognitive. And what's interesting is that in the literature is that medicine has kind of hijacked this cognitive aspect of empathy. And in fact, what it has led to, in taking it, looking at empathy as purely an understanding of a patient's position and point of view, is, and trying to exclude emotions as a sort of contaminant, has led to a form of practice which has been described as detached concern. Indeed, William Osler originally said that, in fact, one way of treating patients was to be detached, to be out with, to be imperturbable and just looking cold and dealing with the various symptoms. Empathy also has behavioral things. It involves doing something, which then brings empathy into being part of a response to suffering. So it's kind of also involved with empathy is when someone's looking at you, this guy is actually going to do something about my problem. He's not just listening to me to get me out of the room for the next patient to come in. This is someone who is going to do something to help me. So the behavioral things. And on a moral side, empathy is the very basis of ethics. We need to know where someone's coming from before we can look at talking about respecting their autonomy and other things. So the whole fundamental of ethics is trying to understand the other person's point of view. In the literature, it is also, not only is empathy confusingly described, but it's confused with compassion and sympathy, and it's beyond the bounds today just to go into that, but that is also confusing. I want to move on now to the findings of my research. And first of all, with that first research question into the nature of empathy. And the interesting thing here was that the preclinical group of students, these before they'd had any real contact with patients, they thought of empathy as an intrapersonal attribute. I am empathetic. You are less empathetic. So they saw it as something you either were or weren't or had to a degree. But then the interesting thing is when they began to work with patients, they changed this view altogether, and they began to see that empathy was an interpersonal thing. It's a relational construct which depends on two people. It depends on you and the patient, and it also depends the context of the surroundings. So you might be very empathetic if you had a lot of time to spend with a patient. You might appear to be unempathetic if you were rushing off to go to theatre or something else that you had to do. So These students then had a different view. They could see it as a relational context and dependent very much on context. It wasn't just something they had all the time. This reflects work by Edith Stein, who did her PhD on the problems of empathy in about 1920. I've put the quotes, a few of them. I mean, I had 48 hours plus of interviews, and you can imagine when that's transcribed, how many bits of paper and stuff that was. So there are absolutely masses of material. This is only just to give you a little flavour of what some of the students said. In looking at the process of empathy, the students were interested to explore what is it that goes on when you're empathising with someone. And they emphasise things like approachability. And I think this is interesting for us as educators to say, well, these are the things maybe we could look at if we're trying to enhance empathy or allow empathy to flourish, however we want to look at it. These are the things that we need to look at are important. You need to appear approachable. I don't know if you have the experience when you go to a Tesco cash-out queues and there's a whole lot of people and different cash-out things, and you look and you think, before you've seen anyone, I hope I get that person, because they look approachable, they're friendly and happy and help you pack the stuff, blah, blah. It's the same with doctors. If you look approachable, establishing rapport, the importance, obviously, of empathetic listening. Here is Amy, a Chinese student in year 4. I just put my pen and paper aside and stopped writing every single thing, frantically trying to scrabble the history. I just said, okay, I'm going to listen to her. And she opened up and cried. So just forgot her agenda and did the empathetic thing, which was to look at the other person. In the process of empathy, this process, the students felt, involved the sharing of emotions. And if you share emotions, you share your vulnerability. As Connie said there in year 2, anytime you show emotional connection with another person, you have in some way invested the way you feel in the way they feel. That does, to some extent, make you vulnerable. And this reflects the work of Paul Ricoeur, a philosopher who looked at this and said, why do we talk about the competent, cold doctor and the vulnerable patient? The patient and the doctor both have vulnerabilities and competencies. There is a blurring here. And one of the big central issues of this research was, what is the appropriate emotional content of medical empathy, if you like? And we'll go into this. The students felt that they wanted to reject the view of detached concern. They very much felt that emotions should be part of sharing emotions, should be part of taking a history of listening to the patient's concerns and of clinical decision-making. But at the same time, they have to maintain an appropriate self-other boundary. And this they found very difficult, and it's something that they've strongly put across is they need to have some guidance on this. It really comes from the work of the Carl Rogers, who's the founder of humanist psychology. He said that in psychotherapy consultations, one had to become involved with the patient's emotions and absorb them as if it was the other person, but remembering the as if it is the other person, these aren't your emotions. And that's easy to say, that this psychological trick of actually remembering you're looking at it from someone else's perspective, not from yours. But as Gina says here, you're trying to put it from their perspective, but actually you're thinking, how would it feel in that situation? How would I feel if this happened to me? And this is something which I think we as educators can work with students. It's okay to have this feel of an initial self-orientated view, but later you need to switch into the other perspective. This isn't your mum, this is someone else. This is someone else's family, you need to deal with this. But you can still feel a taste of their suffering. Context they all talked about, and I'll come on to that a little bit. They all mentioned how important it was to be non-judgmental and how difficult that sometimes is when you're faced perhaps with alcoholic patients, obese patients, sometimes psychiatric patients. They found it difficult to empathize with. And then they talked about those different dimensions of empathy that I mentioned, combining in different ways. And Gina said it very nicely, not every patient wants the same thing. So we as doctors need to be adaptable. And I think because we're not always aware of the patient's experience, and that's a sad comment, we have our own way of doing things, and we do that for all patients. So I'm sure we can think of people who are like that, who have the same approach for everyone they see. They talked about different levels of empathy. After they'd done their initial OSCE exams, they talked about fake empathy, where they just did a surface act of, it's kind of hospice lean of the neck and, oh yes, how are you feeling, stuff, to show that you're being empathetic. But they weren't feeling any empathy for the person at all. They were just going through the motions. Then the next level was of detached concern, where you have a concerted effort to understand the cognitive elements of the patient's concerns. And then deep empathy, where you have an emotional connection. And one of the reasons that deep empathy and emotional connections has a therapeutic effect is because it allows people to deal with very deep uncertainty. In my own clinical experience, the deep uncertainties and existential distress that people feel at the end of their lives. Just being there and empathizing with people may sound rather weak and fluffy, but can make an enormous difference if you've got someone alongside who will not abandon you. It can make a huge difference. What about the influences that enhance their empathy in this medical school? Not this medical school, the medical school I was studying. Patient contact came top, but it wasn't just they were just left with a patient. What they wanted was an opportunity to discuss how they felt about the patient, the findings, not just the biomedical findings, but their emotional findings with experienced clinicians, without feeling they were being assessed. That's another important thing with this. They just wanted an opportunity to have feedback and talk with someone more experienced in a supportive atmosphere. And this support I've mentioned here, and it could be informal, just in a ward round or on the side. Other informal supports were that students went to their friends, their family. I was surprised that quite a number went to religion. One person got a lot of support from their mosque, another two from their churches. Positive role models, encouraging role models, who were prepared to share vulnerability and share their enthusiasm. Diana here talks about an experience in an outpatient clinic where a breast surgeon had talked to a woman whose breast cancer had recurred. He allowed her to go out and have a cigarette, come back in again to the clinic, carried on talking about various options and discussing things with her, and at the end of the consultation gave her a hug. And Diana talked about this, and she said he was in theory not supposed to hug patients, but you could tell with that woman that that was what she needed to do as a human being. It was the first time I had seen a surgeon talk about the importance of communication skills. This is a Year 4 student. Their own experience of illness gave some students increased empathy, although in the later years people talked about being slightly wary of this, that one can actually burden patients if you actually come and share too much of your own illness, So that's a thing, like all of these things have to be used with care. Now here was another interesting thing. The students talked about the culture in small teaching hospitals where they were given responsibility and felt valued, in contrast to the large teaching hospitals where they were seen as students, sometimes not even welcomed on wards, sometimes people didn't turn up for teaching and so on. But when they went to these smaller places, they were given responsibility. One student remembers being introduced as a doctor in training rather than as a student. And those little things made a huge difference. And Kim here in Year 6 said that having been on a rural attachment to one of the island hospitals, I hadn't realised there was such a tension in other places, meaning her base hospital, until I went there to the smaller hospital. And all of a sudden everyone was on the same level and people were very much going out of their way to help others. That's really something that we as educators need to grasp hold of and think about. What is the culture like in our hospital? Is it like a small hospital or is it a big place? I know I'm going on a little bit about the inhibiting, but I suppose in fairness you've got to say that in a phenomenological study where you're listening to people over a prolonged period of time, it's human nature to have a good moan, isn't it? I mean, they're going to talk more about these things, but they did talk much more about the inhibiting factors. They talked about the culture of the medical school, which they found conforming. They used terms like herd mentality. Gina called it a dystopian setting, someone else a conveyor belt. They found competition really upsetting and really stopped empathy dead. That they said. And this one here, they all talked about competition, particularly in the first 2 years. Actually, gone later on, it was less competitive, they found. But the first 2 years, people were sort of vying places. I suppose they'd all come from being the best in their schools or whatever. But they found that really distressing. Helen here talks, this sounds really bitchy, but they do very well at medical school. And you look and think, I wouldn't want to talk to you. You're a bit scary. Yeah, but they get the top grades. So that was a bit bitchy. But anyway, to give an example, kind of, isn't it? When you're wanting to see a doctor yourself, you want someone who didn't necessarily get the gold medal or had a PhD. You want someone who'll relate to you as a human being and is competent. Inhibiting empathy on the reflex of the lack of patient contact. Amy, I remember telling me that she nearly gave up medicine in second year because she was so fed up with all the science that she'd actually lost sight of what this was all about. They were worried too about the strong biomedical bias in this university, and it infused everything on the ward rounds. When people were presenting back cases, there was a great urge and drive to present the biomedical symptoms and signs. People weren't interested about this struggling human being and where they lived and their family and so on. This was all maybe added on in a token way if there was time. Students found negative role models really distressing, and there are a number of those that they quoted, and it just shows too, made me realize how closely students watch us and how much they're influenced by consultants. It's quite scary. I don't know if I go back to doing it now, but, they watch you and they see what kind of doctor you are. She talked about a woman with some learning disabilities who went to a clinic with her father because she needed some support. And Marilyn's perspective on this in the outpatient was, this surgeon tells her she can drop dead at any minute and she needs to have surgery, and that surgery has a 10% chance of death. Without giving them any time to process, without making sure they're okay, handing them the paperwork, saying it all in the same tone as if he was ordering a latte from Starbucks. Sorry, I've gone too far. The other thing they mentioned with this detached concern is they sadly saw professionalism being taught as detached concern, as watching your back. Professionalism meant being a bit sort of detached and out of it, and certainly not hugging patients was that professional kind of thing. And I think genuinely their medical educators were distressed to think about that, because I'm sure they didn't want to get that message across, but somehow that's the message that students picked up. Many of them felt that they weren't valued by the university on an individual basis. They were numbers. They're often introduced as S1373079. That's who I am, by the way, or was. You were given a number, and that was how the university related to you. Diana, an excellent student in year 6, was looking after her grandmother who died of a terminal illness, and had been going at the weekends to see her, and my grandmother died 2 weeks ago, and she went to a GP placement. They said they were okay about it, but they weren't great. I said, sorry, I had to miss a day and a half because I'm going to a funeral. I will make up the time. And they said, okay, we'll get rid of your day off then. That isn't valuing a student. It's almost unbelievable, listening to that. But a lot of students talked about very harsh attitudes to sickness absence, things like that. We've got to, we have these attitudes to patients. We see, why can't we extend our clinical gaze to students and see them as colleagues and people who need support? They all had a fear of challenging authority. None of them would question consultants if things weren't done the way they felt was appropriately. They were very distressed, as I said, by poor practice. There were examples of bullying, examples of the denigration of GPs and of general practice, not just by the teachers, but by other students. So it's kind of scarcely, as Baker wrote in the Royal College of GPs journal, it's scarcely, when this is going on, it's scarcely wondering that there is a recruitment problem in general practice. Bullying, I spoke to Lisa, and she said, well, this week, when she was thinking of an episode of when she'd been bullied, she said the consultant, introduced me to the patient, saying I was going to be a doctor in a couple of years' time. And it was rather scary since I got to this stage and couldn't read an ECG. So it makes you feel a bit small, nervous laugh. This was one of the areas in the research which was quite difficult, because quite often it occurred that people broke down, people were distressed with their experience, and obviously from an ethical point of view, my main concern was the well-being of the students, and my prime concern was that. So you have to come out of researcher mode and say, well, hang on a minute, Lisa, we need to talk about this. Who do you think's got a problem here? Why do you think someone would behave like that and humiliate a student? And so you have to go back out of it to help them. And there are a number of occasions where people were very distressed. Assessment was another big thing, because when it comes to assessment, you just end up preoccupied. Am I doing the right thing? You're not thinking about the other person. Empathy is all about the other. It's not just thinking about, am I doing this right? Am I getting it right? They talked about the fake empathy I've alluded to, things like ICE. They joked about ICE, kind of ICE, the ideas, concerns and expectations, which is kind of the heart of empathy, where Peter Tate, an inspired GP who thought about this, he would be going mad if he thought it was used in this way, that it kind of added on at the end of a consultation, I'm going to ICE the patient. If there's time, said one student to me. Well, this is the essence of the whole business. This is what we're here to do, is to find out what the patient's ideas are. Context makes a huge difference to how you can empathize. If you're stressed, it's very difficult. You've got your own hassles and stuff, which we all have, our own baggage. And it's difficult to be empathized with that. Time, people saw quite a tension between empathy and efficiency. But actually, if you get down to it, as I was alluding to that fact about empathy and the Tesco cash-out person, it actually doesn't take long to communicate to someone that you care about them and you're listening to them. You just take your glasses off, don't look at the computer screen, and just sit and look with them for a bit and listen. The average time it takes for a doctor to interrupt a patient is 23 seconds in a consultation. The average time it takes for a patient to express their concern is 2 minutes. So it doesn't take that long if you can't empathize with someone who's looking at a screen or looking at a thing. They may be doing lots of good things on that, checking your blood pressure's been done or whatever your last appointment was. You need to engage face-to-face with people. The other thing that came up was quite a surprise, was alcohol, both in its isolating effect, and also one student who was a teacher herself for a PBL group said she was a Year 5 student and she was teaching some Year 2 students, and she said the 6 students who turned up to a PBL session in the morning at 9 o'clock, they were all either hungover or drunk. And the other side is the isolating. Amy, the Chinese student, said, at first, I guess, coming from an international background, you want to come and mingle with everyone. And that was a big struggle, because I don't do alcohol, I don't go to clubs, I don't pub, whatever. I guess as hard as you try to fit in, it's difficult when there's nothing I can talk about. I mentioned stress, and even physically here, I don't go to all of these things, but Diana reflected that on the ward, there was this little cupboard that they called the crying cupboard that you actually went into to hide away so that you didn't show your colleagues you were distressed and you cried on your own. Terribly sad, but kind of it's a metaphor for what we're expected to do, this myth of the invulnerable doctor who's away from emotions and doesn't get stressed and doesn't cry. The lack of support, again, the personal tutor system they had in this particular medical school varied, like a lot, I think, is it depended on the personality of the tutor. And Olive there, I just gave a slightly humorous one, which says, the personal tutor, first of all, says, I'm not your mum, so if you've got any worries, I'm not the one to deal with it. That's a bit of a parody of it, but it's to try and say, people who are personal tutors have to be clear that they do have a pastoral role as well as their other role. The sad thing was they often reflected on missed opportunities in their education to talk about empathy. Gina said, we've never had someone sit there and maybe talk about the idea of empathy as a concept, or maybe sort of boundaries of communication. I think it would be beneficial. So the 3 themes that came out of this work that was regarding emotions was students' perception of connecting emotionally as a risky business, detachment as a coping mechanism, and how do they keep this self-other boundary. There were different camps, and some thought that if you shared emotions, you would burn out, or in some way it would impair clinical decision-making. This kind of received medical wisdom list, kind of, we don't want to get emotional decisions. But on the positive side, the others said they felt much better about their consultations and increased job satisfaction when they did share emotions. They felt much less stressed, and the decisions they made were better ones. And this reflects Jackson's work, which you can look up on clinical oncologists, who showed that the cohort of oncologists who engaged with dying patients and shared emotions had much less burnout and stress than the ones who just addressed the issues of their chemotherapy regimes. And here again, the students talk about being personally affected by the way someone's feeling. And it wasn't a uniform thing. Most of them said, like Paula, you have to. But then Marilyn, there are always people, and I think the strength of qualitative research is you report the things that are different. And Marilyn says, feeling what the patient feels, no. So if we're going by that strict definition of empathy, don't do it. She did change her mind with time, but that was her initial thing. Let's get involved there. Again, they're reflected on professional detachment, this detached concern, professionalism as detachment, and Diane sums it up nicely with saying, I think sometimes professionalism numbs human emotion. The boundary, the students describe various ways they had of having an appropriate boundary to remember that it was the other person. Some people did it by compartmentalization, of saying that this is work and this is fun and so on, and they kept the two separate. Others immersed themselves in the patient experience and listened to it with curiosity. What they really valued was an opportunity to reflect, to step back from it. So they get in, they get involved, but then they get back and they think and they reflect on where am I, why am I got these feelings, what's this doing, and so on. And this sort of support in reflection, in verbal dialogue, as Gadamer would say, the philosopher, that it's through conversation we get the interpretation and meaning, is that this support is a dialogue. It isn't reflection of writing 2 sides of A4 in your portfolio. Most of the students absolutely hated that, and most of them found it completely unhelpful. What they found really helpful was to sit down and talk and listen and get feedback and a dialogue. And all these things help to build resilience. This is them talking about those things. You have to take on someone else's problems. It's being able to pause and reflect. What they lacked was the guidance and discussion that there's a difference between appropriate empathic concern, which I mentioned to you is other-directed and is a sharing of emotions as if it was yours, but it is as if they're not your emotions, they're the other person's, and personal distress, which is self-directed and leads to burnout. And the key thing, as I keep coming back to, is the space for reflection with clinicians. The changes in empathy, I won't go into all of it, but these students, despite all the stuff they said about the things in the course that inhibited them, they all felt that as they went through the course, they became more empathetic and more patient-centered, particularly the clinical group. The preclinical group didn't have the patient, so they said they felt more confident about, taking a history or talking, but it was more self-confidence than empathy. But the other ones, they said definitely they got, and their stories showed that they became far more patient-centered. And they talk about Diana here as you go through your exposure to distressing things. And Neville, who said, I came into medical school thinking that medicine was all about science. How wrong I was. The science is a given, but what makes a good doctor is much more than that. These things we know. This is not rocket science. We know this, but why don't we do it? In phenomenological research, this is 16 students over 5 years. You have to be tentative about what you claim are implications. I do suggest, though, that this is a longitudinal research is a useful way of understanding the student's world, because with the longitudinal research, you're developing a relationship with the students, they trust you, the empathy between you develops. In future, I would suggest that more qualitative studies need to be carried out rather than repeating the measures. And actually, if you really think about it, what are we measuring? If you fill in a tick box 20-item scale to say whether you're empathetic or not, what are you actually measuring? An attitude, a belief, a behavior, a virtue? Well, I mean, there's been hundreds and hundreds of papers on measuring empathy on these scales. We need to do this work, I think, in other medical schools, because this could be an outlier, I don't know. It'd be very interesting to know, and we'll have a chat afterwards, what medical educators think about this, and obviously what patients think. What sort of doctors do they want? The implications for education from this study would be there needs to be a restoration of the balance between the biomedical and the psychological, psychosocial. We've kind of lost it a bit with it. Evidence-based medicine is clearly important, but we need empathy-based medicine. Empathy is all about narrowing these polarities, getting them away. We need both of these things. These students would have wanted very much earlier patient contact and patient-based learning, ways of involving the patient. It doesn't take a rocket. It doesn't mean you've every time got to have a patient in front of you. It's just that if you were giving a talk on asthma, or a lecture on how to manage asthma, you might, at the end of it, just have some time saying, what do you think it's like having asthma? What's it like when you're breathless? When you can't have intimate relations with your wife? When you feel silly, you have to give up your job? What's the experience of asthma like? This is what phenomenology is. It's how you experience it. Patients are not a collection of symptoms and signs. They are struggling fellow human beings. The students needed guidance on setting boundaries. And experienced good role models could do that. Just by the way they work, they can show how you do this. There needs, I think, to be some culture change in valuing students and what Ricoeur called a tolerance of imperfection, an ethics of imperfection. You don't have to be the best and the gold medal and striving and beating people to be more competitive. This is not what medicine's about. There isn't a World Cup of medicine, okay? It is not a competitive sport. It takes some people a lifetime to realise that. I think too, and there's evidence from the literature, that introducing the humanities into teaching, into the curriculum, is one way of giving a forum to explore these things, of developing things like narrative competence, of exploring emotions in a safe environment. And I would suggest, like Donald Schoen said 40 years ago, that we should incorporate phenomenology into our educational approaches. Last words. Neville here, a brilliant student, he wanted to have air miles for doctors, so we just clock up your air miles the number of times you actually sat with patients. He said, there are no shortcuts. There's no short way around this. You need to sit down and see people. I'd like to thank the 16 medical students for sharing their experiences, and I hope that I've done them justice. Also my PhD supervisors, and I would add examiners, to librarian Marshall Dozier, Linda Pollock, who typed the transcription, Scott Murray and his department, and all the colleagues. I'm very grateful to you at Dundee for inviting me back. And without Prue, none of this would have happened. Thank you.
Medicine is not a competitive sport. I think that's a really, really powerful message just at the end there, actually. Because when I was at medical school, it sure as hell was a competitive sport, and I appreciate that's 25 years ago. I wonder how much that has changed. So I was interested in your Tesco choosing a cash out line. I suspect I'm some form of high performing psychopath, because I don't choose anyone. I go for scan as you shop. But I think actually, going back to something you said earlier on, is that you talked about empathy being a sort of sliding scale depending on how busy you are. And I think that resonated with me, because we're really busy, aren't we? I mean, who in here is going to tell you that they're not busy? So the time that you have to invest in an individual consultation, that one episode when you know you've got 25 borders to see and a grand round to chair and all the rest of it, it shrinks it all down, so that empathy, is the other side of the balance, isn't it? And I think that is very, very interesting. I know, but what the patient sees, or the relative see at the other side, is just what you're like. they don't see that you're balancing 16 balls behind your back. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. And scan as you shop's really quick, okay? Anyone got any questions or comments they'd like to make whilst I boot up this microphone? Oh, yeah, hang on. I'm just going to make sure this works. There you go. Hang on.
Hi. I think we're related. I'll tell you why later. But no, I studied phenomenology as well. I sometimes feel like people don't understand what I'm talking about often. But my question is, what I'm interested in lately a lot is the limits of disability. If students or professionals have a certain disability, are they actually suited for this profession? So what do you think about students who might have severe autism and they might find out during their degree, and actually empathy might be quite difficult for them? What would you advise such students?
I think that's a particular small group that you mentioned with autism who have difficulty relating and empathizing with other people. I think you can work with that, and certainly there are a lot of, if I can slightly dodge it by saying, it may be that someone with autistic, on the autistic spectrum or severe autism like that, might be directed perhaps not going into a people-orientated specialty. And isn't it funny how in medicine the high prestige specialties are the ones with probably the least patient contact? I'll leave you that to think about. But anyway, so someone with that there might be areas of medicine they can do. But I firmly believe that, and the neuroscience supports this, that we have the pathways for empathy, apart from specific example that you mentioned there. But for most people, the vast majority of people have the pathways there for empathy, and it may be their previous experience, it may be their urging to achieve and to be competitive and so on that drives stuff out. But I think you can work with that. I think that if the medical school gives a message that this is important as the biochemical pathways, people don't say, that's the sort of fluffy stuff we do on the edge. It's not. This is what it's about and is as important. And if that message started to get across, then I think you would move away from the detached concern and people would behave more in a way. And just to come back to Tom's thing about the time, students were also very distressed about the speed of ward rounds. They watched people whiz round ward rounds and they could see that patients still had questions unanswered. The psychological stuff wasn't dealt with, and they zoomed on from one person to another. And that really distressed them. And I think there are people... we can just say, of course, it all got to be very busy, but there are thinking doctors like Verghese in the States at Stanford who has put forward the idea of a more slow medicine in which listening is valued, that if a student is taking more time with a patient, you don't get at them for being inefficient. You say, okay, you've got to have more time. Maybe we've got to speed up over time. But that's a good thing. Whereas I can remember when I started in general practice, my surgery stretched on into the whole days and nights. I was so slow. And I felt terrible. I'm a lousy doctor because I am so slow. But it just takes time to get in and to learn about patients. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's as good as I can give.
Hi, David. Can I just say to everybody, if, like me, you're looking forward, you want more of this conversation, then do join us afterwards. We're all going to meet up.
Teaching room 5, we're going for a wee chat.
Okay. So I just want to nail my colours to the mast and say I lead on phenomenology. So I teach phenomenology, and my own PhD had phenomenological, so I'm with you already.
Oh, great.
But I just wanted to add something, which was my studies were looking at how medicine can actually learn from other professions who are already engaged in this stuff.
Yes.
So, for example, in medicine, there was, up until about 10 years ago, there was still an argument about could you teach emotional intelligence, could you teach empathy? But if we look at other professions like social work or counselling, yes, you can, because they have been teaching this stuff for a long time. And there is a body of work out there which looks at enabling students to know when to become detached, because it will serve the patients clinically, and when it will serve the patient much more to actually engage. But that needs something called being able to manage emotional labour. So if anybody's interested in sort of some theories about how to, do come and see me, because I love the stuff. But, how to teach this and steal things from other professions and from medics who, like yourself, who have engaged in this. There are ideas out there to borrow.
Great. That's a great comment. I think it's absolutely right. And it is others. The nurses are miles ahead of us. They've done far more phenomenological research than we have. And social scientists, you say, and psychology and counselling have all used these methods way before. This is the first longitudinal phenomenological study on medical students in the world. Okay, this is the first one. There's so little in the literature on it.
Hi, David. Thank you very much for that. Some of the comments that the students made were quite stark about doctors and senior doctors. I wondered if the students made any comments on their views on empathy in relation to doctors and other healthcare professionals from 2 points. Either did they feel any empathy towards them when you think about some of the factors that might have been influenced their behaviour, or did they make any comments on what they observed in healthcare professionals demonstrating empathy towards each other?
Yes. Thank you very much for that, Fiona. I don't know if you remember the girl, Diana, who was in the breast care clinic, or that consultation went on with the surgeon who hugged it, and she said, the funny thing was, he talked the same way to his staff. He listened to them, he talked to us. So it actually pervaded the whole way in which that surgeon worked, was to be empathetic and listen to other people's concerns and to be caring of other people and colleagues. Particularly it came across with the people who went on the rural attachments to these smaller hospitals. I found it really sad. The main teaching hospital is regarded somewhere you regard as a student. You have to go to somewhere on Orkney or something to find a hospital where people cared for you. But, the nurses in one hospital spoke to the student and said, "Thank you for being with us. Remember, you will always have a home here." I mean, can you imagine a consultant saying that on the ward? I mean, it's just that bit of care for someone. It takes a millisecond to do, and it's so powerful. It's taking the student to coffee with you. It's another colleague. Take the student in the team with you. And people were so appreciative of this happening, and it did happen. Perhaps I have given a slightly skewed, because they did talk more about the negative than the positive, and I've given the reasons for that. But they did talk about the powerful effect, and some of the students said that as well as their empathy for patients increasing, they found that they were more empathetic for their colleagues and their teams as well, that developed as they went through. And this was reflected in I haven't included it in this, but they had a whole section of talking about their concerns for the future. What kind of doctor will I be? Will I be able to be the sort of doctor I want to be when I'm in what Schoen called the swampy lowlands of clinical practice, when I'm busy and things, will this all go out the window? So they were really worried as to how they would be as foundation doctors, and they wanted to be empathetic doctors.
My question is to do with the 16 balls behind the back. So when you're in service as a doctor and there are 10-minute appointments in GP land, or in clinical practice you have 30 people to see before lunch and a clinic and things like that, what do you think would be a helpful take-home for people who are part-time educators, so not people who are in the medical school who perhaps have time to impart in a long, lengthy way what clinicians will say, actually move on with the history, don't tell me about the 10 daughters. What do you think is a useful take-home for people who are clinicians who do have interactions with students and could be maybe more empathetic and less concerned about time?
Well, I suppose the thing is that when I went into a different life, I was a GP for 20 years before I retrained in palliative medicine. And when I went into general practice, we had 5 minutes for each patient. And I spent the first year in there trying to convince people that this was utter madness and that we needed a bit more time, made it 7.5 minutes, and so on. Maybe there's an exercise that's got to come from the top, that actually to say to practice medicine properly, we do need a certain amount of time. We also need to use teams, obviously, and that maybe if I haven't got the time to do it, maybe there'd be someone else who is a skilled communicator, a nurse in the team. Also, I'm not suggesting nurses aren't busy before I get killed, but there may be someone else in the team who would have the skills to sit and listen with the patient. So it may be just opening that door as well. I'm not suggesting it's easy, but this needs to come from the top. It needs to be evaluation. See, students in this university saw, now we're having the science year, and it was a science year, it wasn't a clinical year, the intercalated year, is compulsory. Now what does that message give to students on the ground? Science is the big thing, it's the importance. There's no saying, well, let's have a year of doing psychology, or a year of counselling. People would say, what's gone on in a medical school, But that might be a valid way if you want to have empathetic doctors. And I would suggest to you that when it's your turn and you go and see a doctor, that is just the sort of doctor you want.
Righto. The time is against us. And we all have to move on to the next thing. I hope that some of you will consider going on to David's work group and talking more about empathy. Now, you mentioned that you might be giving a lecture about asthma, and next week's Grand Round is about asthma. We're very, very lucky, not that we weren't lucky to have you, but we're very, very lucky to have Jodie Simpson, who's coming all the way from New Zealand to come and speak to us at Grand Round about the Amazers study. It's Amazing Asthma, which is a really fascinating, I'd say this, wouldn't I, do asthma? It's a fascinating paper talking about the interactions of macrolide antibiotics in asthma. Now you think, well, that's a little bit scientific and nerdy, but she's a fantastic speaker, and she's going to talk about the implications that asthma has on people's lives and how we can help improve the lives of people with asthma. If you were asleep during this presentation, you can watch it all on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. We now have over 100 subscribers. Brilliant. Go and click here if you want to see another video, and down here if you'd like to subscribe. I'd like to thank David for coming all the way here and giving us a fascinating talk. It's nice to see some students here, medical school folks and palliative care colleagues, and we've even got people on the top tier, so that's nice to see. Okay, thanks very much. We'll see you again next week. Thanks again.